Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to King Arthur. This is a request by Christian Paredes, and before we get into it, I want to apologize for the delay on this. I had to check out the changes in the new update first, so I took a day to do that. But here we are. That's also why I forestalled this video as well, because I knew the update was coming up. Back to the point, this is going to be the discussion on building King Arthur in the solo lane. My favorite role to play him in, and personally the best role for him hands down, by a long shot. Now, when you're playing King Arthur in the solo lane specifically, you have the unusual advantage of having literally twice as many abilities, and this is actually why I'm in jungle practice here, because you can see I use the yellow ability, we switch to the blue abilities, use a blue ability, switch to the yellow, use a yellow, switch to the blue, so on and so forth. This also means that King Arthur has two ults. Now, I've done this ahead of time, but you'll see that the Excalibur on, above the abilities there, above King Arthur's portrait, that is yellow currently, and so is my ult. Right? This means that I get the Excalibur's Wrath ult, which is this. Alright? And then the energy goes down. Right? And then I just build up my energy again, and then I have the other ult, the second ult, which comes up. Right? Lovely. Everyone loves to see that. But that little energy bar only affects which ult you have. That is really the only purpose of it. Another thing, well, actually, let's get into the abilities really quick. Now, Steadfast is a passive you can generally ignore. Every once in a while, I'll reference it while building items. I will obviously let you know when that happens. But this only stacks 4 times, which only gives you 4% damage mitigation. It does increase your energy gain, which can be very nice, especially after you use your Excalibur's Wrath ult. That can really speed up how quick you go with the good old getting up to the second one, the Sundering Strike. And for this actual specific reason, you generally don't want to ult before you've hit the enemy with 4 abilities. Right? Now, before, I very specifically hit Guan Yu with no abilities beforehand, right? So let's go on ahead and fight Guan Yu here a little bit. Alright, Guan. I'm probably going to just straight out kill you first, so that way I can get a nice fresh Guan Yu, which sounds kind of weird out of context. There we go. Alright, Guan, coming back for you. But what you're going to want to do usually before you use the Excalibur's Wrath ult, you want to make sure you have these 4 stacks. This is the only time you really need to think about the stacks for this. But you have the 4 stacks, right? And then we go on ahead and use the ults, and then what we're going to be wanting to do is stacking up. You can see how quickly I stacked up that energy compared to before when I didn't have any of my passive stacks, right? It's a huge difference that can make. So again, before you use your gold ult, or the yellow ult, depending on what color you see that as, you do want to have the 4 stacks there, not for the damage mitigation, but for the energy gain rate, which is going up by 80%, which helps you very quickly get to the second ult. So you can basically almost double ult an enemy in a very short time span, which is incredibly powerful. All right. So other than that very specific situation, you really aren't going to be paying too much attention to the ult, right? A second thing to note, and I'm going to go ahead and go into some Odin bots for this, is that your auto attacks, despite being AoE, all of them, don't activate item effects. So I could be doing this all day with Toxic Blade or Chin Size. They wouldn't activate. Hydra's Lament doesn't activate. Literally anything like that doesn't activate at all. Alright, and furthermore, you'll also notice down in the bottom left corner, I have technically 0 attack speed. That is because this is the only attack speed that King Arthur will have. Any attack speed you would normally get is instead converted into energy gain increases by 1/3 of whatever your attack speed gain rate would be. Now, his abilities, generally speaking, are very straightforward. Some of them have secondary effects. I do want to really quickly mention this ability here, the first ability, which is specifically called Overhead Slash. That ranged attack does 1 hit at range, but at melee range, you'll notice if you pay attention, you'll see 2 numbers. Boop. It actually does an additional roughly 50% extra damage. And that 50% extra damage actually qualifies as a second hit. Okay? Now, this is very important when we're building King Arthur, okay? We'll get into that. Now, for his other abilities, this ability right here, the Sweeping Strike, that's a cripple. This Stomp is a slow. This ability, as you just saw, is a pop-up. This is just a regular dash for raw damage. This is the spin to win for also damage. And obviously, when I was playing around with the ults earlier, you have a stun or the pop-up into a series of slashes, right? Again, that will also be very relevant for building King Arthur in the future. Now, how do we build King Arthur, right? Well, generally speaking, you have 3 options when building King Arthur for starter items, alright? The first one, which I'm going to mention right off the top, just because I say this is about literally everyone in solo lane that's physical, Tainted Steel if you expect your opponent to be healing themselves, right? Now, with the new update, a couple of things has changed, but Soul Eater isn't really that useful, so I didn't want to actually buy it. Soul Eater isn't as useful as it used to be. So, generally speaking, not a whole lot of people build this anymore, currently. Some still do, and it still can be effective on certain gods, but due to the fact that this has sort of fallen out of favor, it's not as common to need Tainted Steel. In fact, the only time I build Tainted Steel very consistently is if I'm against Hercules, Erlong Shen, because he's got physical lifesteal on his first ability, which is something that not a lot of people are aware of, or talk about, let me rephrase that. And maybe Vamon, possibly. Generally speaking, and Vamon is really up to you, and Sun Wukong as well, potentially you might want to bust out Tainted Steel. While there are the occasional other gods that heal a substantial amount that you would want to be wary of, such as Chang'e and Hel, for the most part it's going to be the warriors that self-heal that's going to be a problem, because even the self-healing mages, generally speaking, are going to be taking additional damage from you anyways, so you might be able to get away with not using Tainted Steel. It really depends on how confident you are in your ability to deal damage. Yeah. That's a conversation that you kind of have to decide for yourself. Do you want to go with Tainted Steel and go for the protections and a little less damage, or, and get that anti-heal, or did you want to just go into one of the other starter items and rush Brawler's Beat Stick? That's going to be a matter of personal preference. Against warriors that self-heal, like I said, those 4 that I mentioned earlier and others like them, Mulan is another good example, I would probably go with Tainted Steel. But against a mage that self-heals, Ra, Hel, Chang'e, Baron Samedi, it might actually be worthwhile to go heavy on the damage and just out-damage them, because in a lot of cases in the early game, you as King Arthur are going to out-damage them. Basically, he operates as a physical mage, essentially, right? He has ability-based damage as his primary focus. Well, most mages deal ability damage as their primary focus, but King Arthur has the advantage of having literally double their abilities. So in most 1v1s against a mage solo lane, King Arthur can generally out-damage them, okay? Most cases. That being the case, Brawler's Beat Stick combined with some more damaging starter item is generally going to serve you a little bit better than building Tainted Steel and going with a bit of a more defensive item. Especially if you're a more aggressive player and you really like the boxing anyways, right? But that is generally my approach to Tainted Steel with King Arthur. Now let's look at the other 2 options. I do want to really quickly mention Warrior's Axe. Now, because of the way King Arthur works, you're pretty much going to be activating this almost automatically every 10 seconds. It is a nice burst of heal. It is a nice bit of extra mana. Generally speaking, I don't go with this as often in recent times. There are a couple of reasons for this. Namely, one of them is Bluestone Pendant's incredible utility with King Arthur. Now, when you use Bluestone Pendant on King Arthur, you actually have to slightly change how you attack with him, right? You actually have to create a rhythm. For example, 1 Mississippi, 2, I actually miscounted, hold on, I delayed that, come here, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi. Well, obviously with that ability that no longer is relevant, but you generally want to chain it with your auto attacks. And I was doing the whole Mississippi for a very specific reason, because roughly speaking, okay, my auto attack didn't activate there, Your auto attack, if you alternate your abilities with your auto attacks, that's generally going to be 2 seconds, and you get to refresh the second stack as the first one is ending. Because if you notice, this is an additional 20 physical damage over 2 seconds with a maximum of 2 stacks running simultaneously. By alternating your abilities with auto attacks, not only can you auto attack cancel, something very useful on King Arthur, but you also have the benefit of basically ensuring that you are refreshing this fairly consistently. Now, in actual practice, if you paid attention, you'll notice that I was actually missing the occasional refresh due to the fact that auto attack canceling is actually slightly faster than that. If you'll actually observe really quick here, pop you with this really quick. Boop, 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 boop. Right, this is slightly faster than 2 seconds, but pretty much every other ability is going to be refreshing that proc, right? And you can see how much extra damage I was doing compared to earlier when I was fighting him earlier, right? So this is a big reason why Bluestone Pendant is such a popular item on King Arthur in the early game. But what about the second item? I just mentioned that Soul Eater isn't very great. In fact, for most of King Arthur's ability hits, he's only healing anywhere between 20 and 40 HP, depending on the individual ability. It's just not as worth it anymore as it used to be. When you are playing King Arthur, you basically have 3 options as your second item. The one that I currently recommend, and this is something I was experimenting with over the update, is very specifically Runeforged Hammer. The reason why is actually threefold. First off, you get a little bit of health and some physical power, and whether you like to increase your teleport early on like I do, or you want to actually start building this as quickly as possible and you just go into the cudgel, which some people like to do, either way, you're not going to be building a specific type of protection, so no matter who your laning opponent is, this is going to be very effective. Additionally, this is a particularly nice thing, as you probably noticed earlier, King Arthur has quite a substantial number of crowd control, right? In fact, we have this, oh, hold on. We have this, which the next ability will actually trigger that. Let me actually kill you really quick, just because I can. There you go. Alright, now that we have a nice fresh Guan Yu, we'll reset our cooldowns really quick. And now that we're on the yellow abilities, this is a really fun combo you can do with Runeforged Hammer. Right? Blast this, let him do his Taolu Assault. Pop, boom, stomp. The stomp is going to do extra damage, right? And then we have the cripple here, and then we're going to slap him with the sword afterwards. Basically, since the only abilities that really don't deal any kind of crowd control is your third ability, even your ults do crowd control, what you essentially want to be doing when you have Runeforged Hammer is to use a yellow ability and then use the accompanying same button blue ability. Again, pop up extra damage with the stomp. Now the reason why the stomp is best here is because the stomp comes out immediately, right? So you get the advantage of that pop-up crowd control to affect the damage of stomp. But then you have this longer cripple, and then that longer cripple will give you enough time to actually use the slightly slower to trigger overhead strike, right? Because you'll notice that this first ability here has a bit of a slower use time. It takes a second for it to come out, rather than the stomp, which doesn't take any time at all, right? It's immediate. So generally speaking, after you use the cripple here, you want to use the overhead strike right afterwards, because that cripple will last long enough where you can actually hit the overhead strike and deal that extra damage, especially if you're in melee. That's actually going to, again, hit twice. Both of those hits are going to be doing 20% increased damage. Furthermore, another fun fact about Runeforged Hammer is that it will actually increase the damage of your ult, which is not something a lot of people are aware of. This ult, and I actually ran the numbers, you can test this yourself in jungle if you want. Runeforged Hammer gives you 30 damage specifically, 30 power specifically, and I ran Heavy Mace, which just gives you 30 physical power, did an ult with that, and then I did an ult afterwards with Runeforged Hammer. I didn't have Bluestone on with either of these, by the way. And Runeforged Hammer, with just these 2 items, increases your damage output by, straight up at this particular point, a good 25-30 damage, 20 to 30 damage, depending on the individual strike, right? It's a fairly decent increase, especially since you're hitting the enemy approximately 5 times. So that's anywhere from like 100 to 200 damage, again, depending on the strike and what other items you're building. Combine that with, of course, the damage from Bluestone, and you're actually doing a fairly substantial amount of damage. Now, there is a quick note I want to throw out on the ult here while I'm talking about it. The best time and the most effective time for your second ult, very specifically the Excalibur's Wrath, the yellow one, that is most effective when between the levels of 5 and 12. Why is that? Because, well, at least by the time the enemy is 12. Once the enemy hits level 12, they're probably going to grab beads, at least most laning opponents do, and they'll be able to cancel that ult out, because a fun fact about Excalibur's Wrath, that you jump up in the air and slash them 12 times, okay, it's only 5 times or so. Is it 5 or 6? 6 attacks. If an enemy uses beads in the middle of that ult, it cancels. The ult stops. They drop to the ground, the ult ends. Right? So depending on when they're... A particularly savvy opponent will use beads right away, and they'll only be hit by that first blow, leaving the other 5 out of the equation entirely. As a result, since, again, most laning opponents build teleport first and beads at level 12, your ult is going to do the most damage when the enemy's level is between 5, well, when you're, after you're level 5, but before they're level 12. After that, it's a bit potluck, depending on when they get their beads, right? So just kind of keep that in mind as well with that ult. But Runeforged Hammer is a really great second item on King Arthur. Again, we're also talking about a large amount of MP5, because as I mentioned earlier, King Arthur's greatest strength is his multiple abilities, but his greatest weakness is the amount of mana that takes up, right? You could see, if I were to say, let me pop down to, there's the reset level. Let me pop down to level 3 really quick, and you can see just how intense the mana use is, right? I'm gonna full kit him, as I would normally in a live session with the auto attack cancels and everything. Right, that just took half of my abilities. I'm sorry, half my mana. I didn't even use my ults. And you could actually see the glitch crop up again where I was able to use my Sundering Strike ult there. It told me I could use it. That's a jungle glitch. So they actually didn't fix this. I thought they had. So that's a glitch that you should be aware of really quick. If you're test running King Arthur, if you're under level 5 on King Arthur, there's the chance that his ult will be activatable, right? Even though it's not actually true. But anyways, back to the point. Well, it's true in jungle practice. I could have ulted Guan Yu there, but it doesn't actually work that way in live games, obviously. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that King Arthur's mana consumption early game is very difficult to deal with if you don't have your blue buff. As a result, something that King Arthur has to keep a particular eye on is his mana camp, because a lot of situations, the enemy jungler, if they're paying attention, is going to try to steal that, okay? So you kind of need to be warding up your blue buff as often as possible, and in fact, it's often worthwhile using your free ward right here, this ward right there. It's often worth using this to guard your own mana buff. Okay, especially if the enemy jungler is someone who traverses the jungle very quickly, like Lancelot or Awelish or Mercury, all of whom traverse the jungle a little bit faster than most other junglers. So these particular junglers, these 3 in particular, are more likely to try to steal away your blue, because more often than not, they're going to have more time to do so than a lot of other junglers are going to, right? So just do keep an eye on that, because if you lose your blue buff before you get Runeforged Hammer online, you're going to have a really hard time with your mana, and even if you lose it after Runeforged with Bluestone, it's still a pretty rough time, alright? You're still going to be on a sort of mana budget, so to speak, alright? So just be very aware that that is a rather potentially crippling weakness of King Arthur. It is actually for this reason that I tend to, even if I don't always do this with other solo laners, I will almost always rush Persistent Teleport, because, at least if I'm behind, because this is going to make a huge difference in whether or not you can effectively farm, right? Just as an aside. But yes, Runeforged Hammer is particularly useful due to its HP and MP5. You can see that with these 2 items. I mean, granted, I am level 3 right now, but I have decent HP and MP5, and if I go all the way to 20, you can see a nice jump there of a fairly decent amount. And again, while it helps, it's not a be-all, end-all, cure-all, right? So what about your third item? Well, of course, as you probably expected, this is going to depend on your laning opponent. If your laning opponent is physical, you're going to want to run Gladiator's Shield. Oh, actually, hold on. I almost forgot. I didn't talk about some of the other items. Now, again, Brawler's Beatstick is only really something I'll build as a second item in the situations where the enemy has a lot of healing and I didn't build Tainted Steel. The only time this really seriously happens is if the enemy I'm expecting to go into lane isn't the one in lane, right? Say there's a warrior, let's say, imagine, let me see, imagine Gilgamesh is the enemy warrior, and then the enemy team also has Chang'e, okay? In that particular situation, if Gilgamesh comes into lane, then me building Bluestone Pendant is the better idea. If Chang'e rolls into lane and I have Bluestone Pendant, now I might be in some trouble. She heals a decent amount. At that particular point, it's still not a lost cause because I can build Brawler's Beatstick as my second item and, like I said before, outdamage her. Now, obviously, Tainted Steel is still going to be the preferred item here because it's going to give you physical and magic protections in that particular circumstance, giving you increased protections against both her minions and her. But on the off chance that I've guessed incorrectly and the enemy rolls in with some sort of self-heal, then at the very least, Brawler's Beatstick as a second item can at least help, right? But that's, again, primarily the only time I'll build Brawler's Beatstick as a second item. Another possible option, but one that I've... A riskier option is the Crusher, okay? Now, the reason why this is the risky option is because you are giving up on that sustain and the HP increase from Runeforged Hammer, and you're going with 10 more power, a little bit of attack speed that's going to wind up boosting your energy gain rate by 3.3%, and 15 flat physical penetration. And that very nice damaging passive. Now, the problem with the Crusher is you kind of are banking on winning that first team fight, right? You could actually, this is fairly effective if you win the first in-lane team fight. Not team fight. The first in-lane boxing match. If you're the first one to get a kill in that lane, you kill your laning opponent, you can get away with the Crusher in a lot of situations. If you don't win that first fight, a lot of the times you're not going to get away with this. You're going to need the HP from Runeforged. You're going to need the sustain from Runeforged because your opponent at that point is going to be approximately half a level ahead of you at that point, and they're going to hit the next level a little bit earlier than you, and they're probably going to try to press that, and you're going to take some extra poke, and it's just going to get ugly without the sustain from Runeforged Hammer, right? Besides the fact, like I said before, Runeforged Hammer actually does increase the damage of certain abilities if you're careful about your timing and how you chain your abilities. So Runeforged Hammer, while not quite matching the potential damage output of the Crusher, does still do some damage. It does offer some damage. So the Crusher isn't really something I go to, but it is something that can be very useful, again, if you can catch that early lead. It is a gamble, though, because if you start losing lane after the fact, which is possible, especially with certain larger self-heals, like Mulan, and maybe you made the mistake of not getting Tainted Steel because you weren't expecting so-and-so or whatever self-healer to be in lane. Now we have a different conversation, right? But while the Crusher can work, just be very careful with it. It is high risk, and you need to win that first... You need to get that first kill in lane before you can bust this out, alright? So just be very aware of that. But generally speaking, most of the time, Runeforged Hammer is going to be your best bet. Now, if your laning opponent is physical, your third item is always going to be Gladiator's Shield. And again, this is because you have 8 abilities at your disposal, so this is going to trigger 8 times on full kit use, 6 times if your ult isn't up, right? This is also, of course, a lot of stats you want to see. You get some cooldown, which you want to see as an ability-based warrior, some health, some physical protection, some physical power, right, which, again, does help a little bit. This is actually going to be helping you a little bit in terms of the Runeforged Hammer damage, and this is a lovely time. But if your laning opponent is magic, what you specifically want is Oni Hunter's Garb. Now, you want this specifically for a couple of reasons. You've probably guessed that the damage mitigation from Oni Hunter's Garb goes really well with the damage mitigation of King Arthur's passive. Suddenly, we're playing with a 4% passive damage mitigation, right? The 4% from his 4 stacks. Now, suddenly, in the middle of, say, team fight in the late game, or even in the mid game, we're now talking about a really nice 13% damage mitigation, including Oni Hunter's Garb, right? Which isn't bad. Keep in mind that Spirit Robe gives you 15% when hit by hard crowd control, so it's a respectable amount of damage mitigation to be getting. So, and also, besides, of course, getting the magic protections we originally builded for, we do get some health, and even more important, we get even more MP5, which really helps us, once again, sustain in lane. Now, if you're facing a magic opponent and you do full build Oni Hunter's Garb, you no longer really have to worry too much about your mana. You can see here where I've got 72, but obviously in practical application, you'd be somewhere between levels, anywhere from level, like, I want to say 10 through 12. So you would probably more like have around the 60-ish MP5, but you have enough MP5 here where losing the mana buff is no longer going to really cripple your ability to box for sustained periods of time, right? But most team compositions are 3 physical, 2 magic, so we bust out the Delightful Gladiator's Shield in most cases, and this is what I'm going to roll with ideally, right? For my 4th item, I do really like Manticore's Spikes. We get both of each protection. Again, we're building this to sort of prep us for starting to rotate and get into team fights. There's 35 of each protection there. We have 300 health. We've got 20 MP5, which, again, we want MP5 as King Arthur. He's very mana intensive even in the late game. And of course, we have all of this crowd control that I talked about earlier with the Runeforged Hammer, right? So we have all of that dropping spikes as well. Although I don't believe the cripple counts as hard crowd control anymore. No, they changed that. I thought so. So other than the cripple, you're also going to be generating a Manticore spike for every hard crowd control that you're busting out, right? And it's an absolutely lovely time. So this is a really nice item to be building on him 4th. I almost always build this 4th. Actually, to be completely honest, ever since this item was released, I think this has always been my 4th item on King Arthur. In all honesty. It's just that good. It's always my 4th item here. Alright? And then, of course, for our 5th item, whatever protection item we didn't build earlier, in this case we assumed physical, so we're going to be building Oni Hunter's Garb. If the reverse had been true, we'd be building Glad Shield here, right? Lovely time. Absolutely fantastic. Now, your last item is going to change very much depending on a couple of factors, alright? There are essentially 3 scenarios that you are going to be considering when building your last item. Scenario 1. Your support has not been doing well. If this is the case, then generally speaking, you're going to go into one of 2 items. Spirit Robe, which is my favorite. Again, we're throwing on some extra damage mitigation whenever we get hit by hard CC. We get 40 of each protection, we get some cooldown, we get some CCR, right? Lovely time. Absolutely great item. I love this item on King Arthur. Now, we're building this to sort of fill out more protections on the team because the support hasn't been doing well, so it's pretty likely if the support hasn't been doing well that the team will need some extra tankiness in the match, right? So you bust out Spirit Robe. The other option, if you prefer, and this is a personal preference thing, Pridwin. We lose 10 of each protection, but we get 10% more cooldowns, and we get a really nice passive that explodes and deals extra damage. Now, which one of these 2 you prefer, Spirit Robe or Pridwin, is, again, a matter of personal preference. I'm a Spirit Robe guy, that is my personal preference, but if you like Pridwin on him, by all means, go for it. Alright, it's only a difference of 10 protections and 10% cooldown reduction. Feel free to experiment and figure out which one you're more comfortable building, okay? Now, it is worth mentioning really quick that Pridwin's shield explosion does in fact get increased by this, right? Because it is technically your shield, and this is not something that a lot of people think about. When this explodes, it is still your damage. Runeforged Hammer does increase that. Okay? So, unless you didn't build Runeforged Hammer, maybe you went with the more aggressive option of the Crusher, then maybe Pridwin wouldn't be the better option. But generally speaking, the Pridwin is going to do a little bit more damage if you can time your crowd control to that shield explosion, and sometimes that's fairly inconsistent because it explodes automatically when the shield dies, so to speak. So just kind of be aware of that. That can be somewhat difficult to sort of time, which is why I don't necessarily always go out of my way for this. Again, this is a matter of personal preference. Choose the protection item you like. But it should be, again, if your support is doing poorly, it should be one of these two protection items in most cases. Every once in a while, you might come up against a 4 or 5-man physical or magic, in which case you would want to increase, obviously, that protection. For a 4 or 5-man magic, I'm fond of Genji's Guard, right? Mostly for the cooldowns and some more MP5 so we can full cap that. I know we'd be overcapping that, but that's fine. If the enemy team has a lot of physical, like they have 4 or 5 physical, I'm often fond of going into Breastplate of Valor for cooldowns and physical protections, and I can glyph this, right? So it's generally, again, those are very specific scenarios. Best judgment there if it's not a balanced enemy team comp. If your jungler is doing poorly, then you want to be choosing from 2 or possibly 3 different other items. If your jungler is doing poorly and the enemy team heals a lot, then you're going to want to go, obviously, once again, with Brawler's Speedstick. If your jungler is doing poorly and they don't have a lot of healing, then this changes slightly. If the enemy team is primarily squishy, which a lot of them are, then you're going to go into the Crusher for the earlier mentioned reasons. This procs a lot with King Arthur. Okay, so you can bust this out and have yourself a really nice extra 40 damage. Actually, it's slightly more than that when you evolve Bluestone, right? It's like between 40 and 45 damage before enemy protections are factored in. It's a decent amount of damage increase. You get some physical penetration, obviously. Again, that slight increase in your energy regen. It's a really nice item for those squishier comps. Again, we do get 15 flat pen here. If the enemy team is tanky and your jungler isn't doing well, then you're going to want to bust out Heartseeker. Again, this is percentage of health damage instead of the Crusher's flat slash scaling to your power, right? And again, we have MP5 here. We get some 10% penetration here, so we get percentage pen instead of the flat pen, and of course we have, again, the percentage of health damage. So this is better against tankier comps. So which one of these items you build at the end does very heavily depend on how well your jungler and or your support is doing. If both are doing fine or both are doing equally bad, then what you might want to be building is going to come down to purely preference. Although in those situations, I'm rather partial to a nice Shifter's Shield, which will give me extra power at the start of the fight, and then after I've been whacked a couple of times, I get a nice spike in my protections, which doesn't really affect my damage that much because those protections are going to be increasing the amount of damage Glad Shield is doing. So if both my jungler and support are either both doing really well or both doing really poor, I'm rather fond of Shifter's Shield. But those are really the 3 scenarios there. Your support is doing poorly, your jungler is doing poorly, or both are either doing poorly or doing well, right? They're both doing about the same, I guess, would be the 3rd scenario description. So for your last item, it really is going to be situational, but you're adjusting to your team, not the enemy team. In most cases, again, Brawler's Beatstick is a rare exception. You might also feel inclined, if your support is doing poorly and you need anti-healing, you might go instead into Contagion or Pestilence, depending on the predominant damage type amongst the enemy. Again, this is a matter of best judgment here, but these are all items that I've found to be fairly effective on King Arthur as last items, again, depending on the context of the situation. Now, again, I evolved to Bluestone Brooch here for very similar reasons as the glorious baseline Bluestone Pendant. I don't really recommend Corrupted Bluestone that often because you're not proccing it quite as often. That is a 5-second proc of 75 damage, alright, rather than the 2 seconds of Brooch, or the Bluestone Pendant itself. There are rare situations where the enemy team has just insane amounts of auto attacks, right? In which case, you know, if they're normally auto attacking comp, I have built Corrupted Bluestone to reduce their attack speed and increase my own protections. That increase in your attack speed, by the way, is in fact going to increase your energy gains, which does allow you to ult very frequently as well. So it's not all bad. It's just, for King Arthur at the very least, it's very situational. It is very much, the enemy team has 3 or more auto attackers, I should build Corrupted Bluestone. Actually, the best example I can think of is when the enemy team I don't remember who their solo lane was, but I evolved into Corrupted Bluestone because they had an Arachne as their jungler, a Soul building full autos in mid lane, and then they had, I think, Chiron going full autos in ADC role. Right, so they had 3 auto attackers on that team, and I think they might have had Ymir as their support, but I can't quite remember. But they had 3 auto attackers on their team, and I busted out a Corrupted Bluestone, and that is very useful there. All right, so that is a very situational evolution, but I have occasionally used it. But 9 times out of 10, since most team compositions don't have an obscene amount of auto attackers, I usually will go into a nice, delightful Bluestone brooch in most cases, right? If you did build Tainted Steel, you're obviously going to be going into whichever one of these two gives you the protections you need more of, right? If they're physical heavy comp, you're going to go into the breastplate. If they're a magic heavy comp, you're going to go into an amulet, right? That pretty much goes without saying. Finally, you generally are going to be going into Sundering Axe. Again, we have all these protections, right? Usually, now Hero's Axe again is very useful if there's like an enemy Fenrir or Daji or Ares. This is really nice for saving at least one life in those situations. As an aside, I don't usually build this. In fact, I think I've only ever built it twice. But that being said, I am going to put one last point here. If the enemy team composition has 4+ magic damage sources, Warding Sigil can be a really effective starter item. Now, I've never personally been in a match as King Arthur where the enemy team in Conquest was 4 magics or 5 magics, right? I've been in Conquests with that situation, but I've never been King Arthur in those situations. I was always somebody else. But in those situations, Warding Sigil being evolved into a late game Sigil of the Old Guard, again, against a 4 or 5 magic comp, is going to be very effective for you because you have all of the damage mitigation from your passive already, the static 5% damage mitigation from this, and additional stacks of damage mitigation after the fact. In fact, against enemy teams combined with all of these mitigations, let's run through the math. King Arthur's 4 stacks, totaling for 4% damage mitigations. Let's assume you're in the middle of a team fight with at least 3 enemies. We're looking at 9% here. So now we're at 13%. We have a static 5% from Sigil of the Old Guard. We have an 18%. And then finally we have an additional up to 4% 3 times. Let's just run that through, right? So that is a grand total of 12%. We were at 18% before, so you can get a nice 30% damage mitigations in the middle of a team fight if you're really lucky, right? Again, getting a lot of these in the middle of a team fight, a large-scale team fight, particularly in the early part of it, is fairly easy. And as the team fight wears down, you lose damage mitigation from Oni Hunter's Garb, and, I mean, the Sigil of the Old Guard triggers anytime that you're hit by an ability, so that's kind of like whatever, right? So that doesn't technically fade. But, yeah, incredibly effective against magic damage compositions, heavy magic damage compositions. I have been experimenting with this a little bit in the early game. The real problem is, in most cases, you really don't need the magic protections in most solo lane matchups because, again, the default in solo lane is warriors, and even those people who don't play warrior in the lane tend to go with assassins instead, right? So the amount of times that I've busted out Warding Sigil and needed those magic protections isn't terribly often, which is the only reason why I don't build this consistently, and it's also the only reason why I'm not recommending you start out with this, because it is going to hurt your damage output, because again, this isn't going to, out-damage Bluestone, and Bluestone, as you can see from how I typically build, is most of the damage of King Arthur, unless the jungler is doing poorly, in which case I splash an end-game damage item, right? So, with that being said, maybe this changes in the future, I don't know, but that is generally how you want to approach building King Arthur. Now, you'll see this more in detail in the next episode when I do a conquest with King Arthur, but with that being said, in the meantime, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.